Well, I think we'll get started, even though this being Washington, there'll be people trickling in for a while longer. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center, where we gather to remember and to honor our friend, Nancy Bernkopf Tucker. I'm Bob Hathaway. I had the good fortune of directing the Asia program for almost 16 years. You see what happens when you retire. They don't even give you a name card anymore. That's all right. When I'm at the river, I don't think of them all the time either. Some years ago, I had the great privilege of helping to inaugurate the Nancy Bernkopf Tucker Memorial Lecture Series. This is the sixth in that annual series designed to commemorate our friend, Nancy Tucker. As I have said in previous years, we are indebted to Warren Cohen down here on the front row, Nancy's husband, but also an eminent scholar of East Asia in his own right. Warren, thank you again for giving us this opportunity to celebrate Nancy's life. Many of us in this room today, indeed probably most of us, knew Nancy as a scholar, a teacher, a mentor, a friend. We at the Wilson Center also knew her as a member of the family. Nancy was a visiting scholar here at the center for a year in the 1990s. During the last 4 years of her life, she was a non-residential senior scholar here. She regularly spoke at our public events. Behind the scenes, she served as an advisor and a counselor, not only for the Asia program, but also for the Wilson Center's Cold War International History program. So she really was a member of the family, and we were and are incredibly proud of those ties. You will have seen Nancy's biography in the program you received as you entered this room. But of course, that bio doesn't begin to convey the full essence of this remarkable woman. The keenness of her intellect, her passion for good scholarship, her delight in good colleagues, the gusto with which she embraced life, or the magnificent courage with which she confronted her far too early death. The printed bio notes her prodigious scholarly output, but it doesn't begin to convey the high regard or the affection with which her fellow scholars regarded her. Nancy cared deeply about China and Taiwan and Hong Kong, and about U.S. policy in East Asia. And she believed that history had something important to say to contemporary policymakers. Indeed, on two separate occasions, she entered government service to use her skills as a historian to contribute to the fashioning of better policy. Boy, do we miss Nancy today. We are delighted to have with us today to help us celebrate Nancy's life someone whose scholarship and intellect so reminds us of Nancy. And it is now my great privilege to turn to Abe Denmark, the director of the Asia program, to introduce our speaker. Thanks, Abe.
Thanks, Bob, and apologies for the name tag. As in your traditions, the re-education the re-education process of our staff will be benevolent and effective. The remarks that you made about Nancy's contributions I thought were especially relevant, and I wanted to share something that I actually experienced yesterday. I was conducting some research on past efforts by the United States to engage with North Korea, and found an interview that had been conducted of Ambassador Chaz Freeman, talking about his experiences as DCM for the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, relating a story that has been contested by others about Deng Xiaoping attempting to get North and South to talk to one another, and that those efforts being undercut by then Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific, Paul Wolfowitz. And I thought it was a fascinating story, one that I hadn't been aware of, and I found that it was originally dug up in a book called China Confidential, written by our friend Nancy. And so the fact that I thought it was a terrific piece of information, but two, the fact that I personally came across it the day before today's event, I thought was especially prescient. And we're delighted, as Bob said, to welcome Shelley Rigger to help us celebrate Nancy and to share her thoughts on Taiwan. Shelley Rigger is the Brown Professor of East Asia Politics, Chair of Chinese Studies, and Assistant Dean for Educational Policy at Davidson College. I hope that means you get three paychecks a week, but probably not. She has a PhD in government from Harvard University and a BA in Public and International Affairs from Princeton University. She's been a visiting researcher at National Chengchi University in Taiwan and a visiting professor at Fudan University and Shanghai Jiao Tong University. She's a non-resident fellow at the China Policy Institute at Nottingham University and a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Among her many publications, I wanted to especially emphasize her publication, Why Taiwan Matters, Small Island, Global Powerhouse, a terrific book that is especially well written for general readership. And with that, turn things over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for being here. It is a simultaneously wonderful, gratifying, joyful, and also terrifying, and like even more terrifying when I actually saw the audience coming in, experience to have the opportunity to be the person giving the lecture in honor of Nancy Bernkopf Tucker, who was one of my personal absolute heroes, professionally and personally. And I have mourned her loss continually over the past years. So I really never imagined that I would have the opportunity to stand before you and to offer thoughts in her honor. But here I am. So thank you very much, Warren, and thank you to the Wilson Center, and I will do my best. This talk was inspired by the theme of a conference that took place in Zurich, Switzerland last week. The conference is the annual meeting of the European Association for Taiwan Studies, which is a wonderful organization, one that sometimes causes me a certain amount of regret because we don't have anything quite equivalent in the US, yet the Europeans have managed to really make their Association for Taiwan Studies successful and very prominent internationally. But their conference theme this year was Sustainable Taiwan, which is a very capacious conference theme. You can have presentations on topics from anthropology to zoology on the theme of sustainable Taiwan. And in fact, they did have pretty much that range of papers presented. But it made me think, what does it mean to say that Taiwan is sustainable? And I started kind of mulling that over. And that led me to the question of, first of all, what do we mean by Taiwan in 2018? And secondly, where did the Taiwan as we know it today come from? How did it come into being? And that led me to what I realized too late, when it was impossible to change my topic and theme because the propaganda had already been printed. It led me to this very dangerous place, which is, given the audience for this talk, history. So a political scientist is going to talk about history, and that is just a formula for trouble. But again, I will do my best. So I'm going to really kind of zero in, I guess, on 3 questions. One, what do we mean by Taiwan in the 21st century? What is the entity which we have in mind, or that I have in mind, and that I think the epistemic community that I'm part of in Taiwan studies, what we kind of collectively have in mind when we say Taiwan? And how did this Taiwan as we know it come into being? And here's where the history comes in, because as I think about it, I have come to the conclusion that Taiwan as we know it is a product of the Cold War and the post-Cold War. There were attributes that Taiwan brought to those moments in history that allowed it to generate and respond to the structural forces surrounding it. So I want to give some agency to Taiwan in this process. But in some very fundamental sense, the Taiwan as we know it would not exist had the world not been as it was at critical moments in Taiwan's development. So that's the second question. And then the third question is, what are Taiwan's prospects in what I can only for the moment call the post-Cold War era? Can a product of the Cold War and the post-Cold War survive in this new historical moment we find ourselves in today? Oh, great. I think another historian just came in. So, first of all, what is Taiwan? What do we mean when we say Taiwan as we know it today? I think Taiwan as we know it today has at least 5 defining features. First of all, it is self-governing. It is autonomous. It does not make sense to talk about Taiwan as a part of the PRC if you are not in the PRC or speaking with a PRC voice. So, what Taiwan's relationship is to China is very complicated, and that's probably the topic I should have talked about rather than delving into history. But as a state, Taiwan is a self-governing, autonomous state. Whether or not it's, in some sense, Chinese, whether or not it is what we would call fully independent, it is certainly, at a minimum, self-governing. Secondly, Taiwan is democratic, and more specifically, it is the kind of state we know as a liberal democracy, right? It has a high degree of freedom. It has a very high degree of tolerance for differences of opinion and debate. Sometimes people don't believe that because Taiwan has such a vigorous political conversation underway at pretty much all times. Sometimes it seems as if it is not a place of tolerance, but I believe that it very much is a society that is highly tolerant of differences of opinion and enjoys actually deliberating meaningfully on real problems. I think it's also definitive of Taiwan to say that it is prosperous. It is one of the most successful economies in the world, and it has come to this prosperity with astonishing velocity and in a relatively smooth trajectory. And one other attribute of Taiwan's prosperity that I think is really remarkable and always bears mentioning is that Taiwan has achieved a high degree of prosperity with a high degree of equality in the distribution of the fruits of its prosperity. And again, this is something that people in Taiwan say, oh, no, not anymore. But if you look at the Gini coefficient, right, Taiwan is astonishingly egalitarian for a society at its level of development and GDP. I also think that Taiwan is defined by a kind of self-awareness or self-knowingness that, again, is often underestimated. So many people think, oh no, Taiwan is consumed in a wrenching and terrible debate over national identity. And in some ways, I understand why that is true. But I also think that precisely because Taiwan has been consumed by the idea of understanding itself and its relationship to its own island, its relationship to Chinese society, to Chinese civilization over centuries, that relative to many other peoples in the world, Taiwanese are particularly aware of their own position and their own identity, both within Taiwan and internationally. And finally, that leads me to another attribute of Taiwan that is definitive and perhaps unique, and that is Taiwan's lack of recognition in the international community, right? There are very few societies that have such integrity in themselves and yet have so little regard in the international realm. So on to the second question. Where did this Taiwan as we know it come from? And the argument I want to make is that Taiwan as we know it, the Taiwan of these 5 attributes, was forged in the Cold War and the post-Cold War. But its development was not solely the product of structural forces we associate with those events. Taiwan, and I guess when I say Taiwan, this is another word that I probably, what does that mean? But what I mean when I say Taiwan is a shifting cast of characters, politicians, activists, cultural figures, economic actors, entrepreneurs and inventors, and ordinary people whose voices were elevated by extraordinary events or by their own endeavors. This whole grand cast of people who brought agency to the historical moments in which Taiwan's critical developments occurred and in which Taiwan's destiny unfolded. So it is this possibility then of some agency within or even against the structural conditions of a particular historical moment that gives me a little bit of optimism about Taiwan's sustainability, to use the language of the European Association for Taiwan Studies, in what is admittedly a very dark moment in history and a difficult moment in history for Taiwan specifically. So the Cold War was a time when a highly motivated and resource-rich United States of America built its foreign policy, both its economic policy and its security policy, around anti-communism. This is something we all know. Anti-communist regimes around the world benefited from U.S. policy in the Cold War era because the U.S. overlooked right-wing authoritarians' repressive tendencies as long as they were fulsomely anti-communist, and because the U.S. extended preferential economic treatment, which enabled rapid trade-driven growth in those anti-communist states. So in countries like Taiwan that were limited in natural resources, what the U.S. invested in as it tried to strengthen those societies and make them robust against communist pressure or aggression, what the U.S. invested in those resource-poor countries was labor. So Taiwan was fortunate in that sense not to have natural resources because what Taiwan got from the experience of being a developmental partner of the U.S. during the Cold War was genuine development and widely shared prosperity, because the nature of the economic interactions between the U.S. and Taiwan were rooted in manufacturing and entrepreneurship. So U.S. security policy was good for Taiwan, and U.S. economic policy was also good for Taiwan in the Cold War era. So Taiwan's survival, right, early in the Cold War, it seemed conceivable that Taiwan would not survive as a self-governing autonomous entity. So Taiwan's survival and emergence in the form in which we know it today was possible because of these different features of the Cold War. One important feature of the Cold War that facilitated Taiwan's survival and development was U.S. domination and anti-communism, as I've already said. The U.S. domination of the international system in this kind of bipolar mode stabilized and secured, and some people would view that more critically and say, suppressed and locked down the international community in a certain way. U.S. domination also included this willingness to be responsible for and to assist in the development of other countries as long as they were anti-communist. Another feature of the Cold War that I think was really helpful to Taiwan and its ability to survive and thrive and grow into the entity it is today was the fact that during the Cold War, for most of the Cold War, China was essentially self-withdrawn from the international community and global interactions. It was entirely focused on its own revolutionary preoccupations, and it put very little pressure on Taiwan, considering how the separation of the two sides began at the end of the Chinese Civil War, or at the cessation of the Chinese Civil War. So that gave Taiwan breathing room to survive and strengthen itself and move through the Cold War era. And it also allowed Taiwan, because the PRC had withdrawn into its own navel, Taiwan was able to hang on to the status, to a global status, and to a position in the international community much longer than I think otherwise would have been possible. So these features then of the Cold War enabled Taiwan to remain self-governing and develop institutions and dispositions that supported and continue to support its autonomy. Economically, anti-communism in the U.S. justified preferential treatment for anti-communist stalwarts such as Japan and Taiwan, which came at a moment of high growth and high confidence in the U.S. economy. So the U.S. was embracing trade-driven growth in which U.S. companies used trade and outsourcing to accelerate their own competitiveness and upgrading. And that feels to me like I just repeated something I said before, but I think in this moment that in which we find ourselves today, we have forgotten the value of trade and interaction and global economic engagement, not only for improving the standard of living of people around the world, but also for accelerating economic progress in our own country. Had the U.S. insisted upon continuing to do the kind of small-scale traditional manufacturing that we outsourced to Taiwan, Taiwan would be an agricultural country and the U.S. would be producing Barbie dolls, right? So I guess I wanted to repeat that because it feels very close to the moment to me. So these trends opened a space for Taiwan to become an export-oriented manufacturing powerhouse, as we know it today, and to simultaneously develop this equitable growth model. It avoided some of the difficulties that normally entangle late developing economies because it was growing into a protected space, a space that the U.S. had carved out for Taiwan and a handful of other friendly countries. So that instead of kind of fighting for light and water in this crowded, weedy jungle of other plants, Taiwan was actually being fed and pruned and watered by an attentive and friendly gardener. Now, the Cold War was not all good news for Taiwan. While U.S. dominance prevented Taiwan from falling to the PRC, it locked the KMT's single-party authoritarian state into place. And Taiwan's rapid economic growth was based on a high degree of exploitation, much of it self-exploitation in this unusually entrepreneurial and small-scale manufacturing economy, but nonetheless exploitation. And also, this rapid economic development did a substantial amount of damage to Taiwan's natural environment. And so sustainability questions in Taiwan today also center on repairing or continuing to repair some of that economic or environmental damage. Also, though, Washington's support for the Republic of China was instrumental. When the logic of the Cold War shifted, so too did U.S. policy. By the late 1960s, the U.S. government was coming to understand that the PRC was no longer allied with the Soviet Union, and the strategic logic of the moment shifted accordingly. And, you know, we see this so beautifully in Nancy's book, Straight Talk. The decision that Nixon and Kissinger made to reach out to the PRC, in making that decision, they were prepared to leave Taiwan to what they expected would be a very predictable fate, a fate that would please the PRC and acknowledge the sad realities of small and weak players like Taiwan. So, you know, Taiwan benefited from the Cold War because it happened to be in the right place with the right orientation at the right time. But when the logic of the Cold War shifted, then suddenly the benefits that the Cold War had afforded to Taiwan disappeared, or seemed like they were going to disappear. Nixon's overture to Beijing, which is every bit as much, right, a part of the Cold War as the U.S.'s lionizing of Chiang Kai-shek as the leader of Free China, could and perhaps should have been the end for Taiwan. But fate intervened, or it is possible that karma intervened, if you believe that, because Mao Zedong died and Richard Nixon was driven out of the White House in scandal and humiliation. So those events, plus the continuing anti-communist fervor of the US Congress, which was very important, kind of opened an air pocket in which Taiwan was able to keep breathing long enough to figure out its exit route. And the exit route they came up with was the Taiwan Relations Act, and a bit more. So the Taiwan Relations Act has had extraordinary staying power as a framework for sustaining a formal relationship between the US and Taiwan, or a semi-formal. You know, you can wear a cocktail-length dress to this semi-formal event. But politically, it was a stopgap measure at best. Taiwan, as it was during the Cold War, was not going to be sustainable in the long run, even under the Taiwan Relations Act. The post-Cold War was coming into focus, even in the early 1980s. And that meant that Taiwan had the opportunity to change and, in fact, needed to change. And so now I am moving on to the post-Cold War. We can see the beginnings of the post-Cold War in the Carter administration, which is odd because obviously the Cold War continued through the Reagan administration. But I would argue that Carter's policies, in particular his human rights and democracy diplomacy, prefigured the post-Cold War era in meaningful ways. And this new emphasis in U.S. foreign policy, this emphasis on human rights and even democratization, came at Taiwan's most vulnerable moment, this moment of this brief reprieve between the Nixon and Kissinger visit and the completion of normalization, just when Taiwan's government and civilians were frantically working to find some way out of losing relations with the United States. So the timing was good here too. The end of the Cold War came at a propitious moment for Taiwan. Some features of the Cold War continued into the post-Cold War era, including, and most importantly, U.S. domination of the international system, or at least a very strong role for the U.S. in the international system, continued in the post-Cold War period, which meant that Taiwan continued to be reasonably secure. Although, again, learning from Nancy, one of the very important things also in Straight Talk is her strong and well-supported claim that Taiwan would never again feel fully secure and confident in its relations with the United States after the betrayal of the Nixon-Kissinger era. So Taiwan was destabilized by the changing circumstances from the Cold War to the post-Cold War era. But the new post-Cold War era actually had different features that turned out to be beneficial to Taiwan in unexpected ways. The new and more genuine emphasis on democracy in U.S. foreign policy supported Taiwan's transition to democracy, and democratization then, in turn, enhanced Taiwan's security because it created a new justification for a strong relationship between the U.S. and Taiwan. Also, in the post-Cold War era, the diminished antagonism between the U.S. and China allowed Taiwan to open its own relationship with the mainland. And while it's a little hard for us to remember this from our perch in 2018, actually the opening to the mainland, the more normalized, not fully normalized in the diplomatic sense, of course, but the more peaceable and cooperative relationship that was enabled by the end of the Cold War between Taiwan and the mainland has had huge benefits for Taiwan's people and for Taiwan's economy. For example, just one example, Taiwan is a high-tech powerhouse today instead of a Barbie doll manufacturer because the Barbie doll manufacturing and the shoes and the apparel and all of the other traditional manufacturing was offshored to mainland China, and that created a space. First of all, it provided capital for investment, and it also created a space in Taiwan's domestic economy for new industries to arise. And the high-tech transformation of Taiwan is the outcome of that process, or an outcome of that process. Also, the way China emerged from isolation in the post-Cold War, so the way China entered the world, again, it's hard to remember, but back in the day, China presented to the international community, including Taiwan, as needy and welcoming. Please, Taiwanese investors, bring your factories to our village. We will make it as easy as we can. We will facilitate everything you need in order to get the opportunity to work for your Taiwanese company. So the way China emerged from isolation meant that it was willing not only to welcome Taiwanese investment and Taiwanese participation in many different activities on the mainland, but also it was willing to look the other way as Taiwan continued to develop as a democratic, self-governing entity. As long as Taiwan's leaders kept up a thin facade of unification sentiment, Beijing was willing to overlook a lot. And it even seemed in the early 1990s as if the two sides could converge in a way that would allow them to settle their differences. That calculus changed in the mid-1990s when the PRC began to realize that Taiwan was headed in a direction that was very averse to its desires and began to more forcefully block the independence movement in Taiwan and to kind of push back against what they saw as sort of soft independence among not only the DPP, but even the KMT. So it was a moment in history. It was not a linear trend in history, but for a while, things were getting better between Taiwan and the PRC in a way that they never could have done during the Cold War. I think globalization, which is also a post-Cold War development, was very helpful to Taiwan as well, especially the World Trade Organization, which turbocharged both the Taiwanese and the PRC economies. Again, for better at the time, and maybe for worse later on. And finally, I think Taiwan benefited from a kind of international conversation or just a kind of vibe around post-materialist values, things like environmentalism and LGBT rights and feminism, and this convergence theory that was popular in the post-Cold War era that argued that all of these trends, the integration of economies, the rising interactions among states, the developing more exciting and entangled supply chains, that all of that stuff was reducing the zero-sumness that had pushed societies apart and held peoples back during the Cold War. So in sum, the post-Cold War was a period of relative stability, prosperity, and openness, unencumbered by the paranoia of the Cold War. And in that environment, Taiwan was able to make the transition to democracy and begin to face the national identity issue and work its way through that issue. It was able to upgrade its economy beyond traditional manufacturing to high-tech. And it was able to become a liberal democracy with generous provision of public goods. The Taiwanese national health insurance scheme is the envy of the world. Should be, if it's not. If your country's not envying it, then you must have a pretty good one. And it also allowed, the post-Cold War also allowed Taiwan to open a mutually beneficial relationship with the PRC. So within these kind of structural developments, Taiwan also had its own role to play. People within Taiwan, leaders, citizens, activists, entrepreneurs, dancers, musicians, filmmakers, writers, all brought something to these moments that allowed Taiwan to make the most of the opportunities history presented it. And I think there are really, it's really bad to generalize about a society, but it seems to me that there are a couple of attributes that we can connect to Taiwan in the aggregate that have served Taiwan well in making good use of the opportunities that history has presented it. The first is openness, openness to opportunity and even to risk, which includes flexibility and inventiveness. And the other is pragmatism, which includes self-awareness and the awareness of Taiwan's limitations. So what we saw in the mid-1990s, for example, when the mainland became more assertive in indicating to Taiwan that the drift toward a high-level and broad-based conversation about formal independence was unacceptable and put Taiwan in jeopardy of military confrontation with the PRC. When that happened, Taiwanese, by and large, looked for pragmatic responses rather than, we don't care what you think, we're gonna go for what we're gonna go for. We'll see what happens. We'll take the risk. They found a way to secure their interests without provoking unnecessarily the kind of response that the PRC was indicating might be possible. So openness and pragmatism feel in some ways like contradictory traits, but I think Taiwan has demonstrated both of these traits in its domestic politics and in its external relations, and that we see those values or those attributes really lifting Taiwan economically, politically, in the way the democratic transition unfolded, with both the opposition and the regime playing a kind of jujitsu of not using overwhelming force, or at first the regime did use overwhelming force and tried to use overwhelming force, but it soon learned after the early 1970s that force was not the answer. And so the two sides in many ways negotiated their way through interaction toward a successful democratic outcome. And also these values are evident in Taiwan's international relations in the way that Taiwan explored and continues to explore possibilities in the international realm from a framework of caution and prudence. So what about the post-Cold War? I read somewhere somebody called where we are right now, or when we are right now, they called it Cold War 2.0. I'm not sure that I liked Cold War 2.0, but post-Cold War is definitely not a good phrase. And I hope that someone else will come up with the clever, internet meme-worthy name for this era, and we can move past post-Cold War. But for now, exactly when the post-Cold War era ended is impossible to say, but our fate was sealed by the ascent of Donald Trump, Xi Jinping, Really, it says D here, and so I just read it as Deng Xiaoping. Our fate was sealed by the ascent of Donald Trump, Xi Jinping, and Vladimir Putin, who are three unapologetic antagonists of liberal ideas, whose rise imperils both the ideology and the infrastructure of the post-Cold War era. So what are the attributes of the post-Cold War? Well, one, the US is in decline, not by necessity or through the machinations of history, but by choice. Two, stability and security in the international system are no longer reliable. We are at best in an age of transactional politics, but we may be in an age of arbitrary and random events driving international affairs to an extent we have not seen. I'll leave it to the historians to tell me since when. Countries are therefore increasingly left to provide for their own security, which takes a bite out of everyone's prosperity as well. Taiwan's position in US foreign policy has long been ambiguous. Nancy definitely taught us that. But it is more uncertain today than ever because neither anti-communism, Taiwan's Cold War virtue, nor liberal democracy, Taiwan's post-Cold War virtue, carries weight with the current crop of policymakers in the United States. Globalization, another post-Cold War attribute that was beneficial to Taiwan, is also under threat. And whatever you may think of it, its effect on Taiwan is to diminish the value of the primary asset Taiwan has to offer the international community, which is its economic contribution. And then finally, in the post-Cold War, China is rising in capability, confidence, and ambition. And it is apparent that, at least in some respects, its patience is waning. So the post-Cold War looks bad, in my view, for all of us, but it looks particularly bad for Taiwan. So because I am an inveterate optimist, I have this like happy gene that just won't quit. I have to find a way to imagine that the post-Cold War is yet another era in which those lemons can be made into lemon-flavored tea. No one in Taiwan drinks lemonade. Through Taiwan's introduction of its virtues of openness and pragmatism to reinvent itself yet again. The international situation is clearly much less predictable than in the past, and Taiwan's primary adversary is gaining strength relative to Taiwan's primary advocate and defender. That, combined with the apparent, at least for the moment, US retreat from global leadership, means that even if the US could defend Taiwan, it might choose not to. And that has put Taiwan in a moment of growing isolation and diminished room for maneuver. Meanwhile, the US-China relationship looks like the Cold War, but which Cold War? We don't know whether the US will decide to weaponize Taiwan, a la Eisenhower, or abandon Taiwan, a la Nixon, or both simultaneously. And domestically, Taiwan's political future is also uncertain. Can Taiwan's democracy deliver good economic results? Can it harness resources to benefit the whole society? Can the society accept the necessary compromises of a democratic process? These are possible, but not easy. So the post-Cold War doesn't look promising for Taiwan, but the window afforded by the Cold War didn't look promising for Taiwan either, and nor did the post-Cold War in 1972. Nobody in Taiwan thought, oh, this is excellent, this is good news, right? The world is changing. So, and yet, both the Cold War and the post-Cold War have left Taiwan with sources of strength. Among those sources of strength are financial capital and human capital, including an alert and engaged workforce that accumulated during these earlier periods and could propel the next stage of development if Taiwan continues to act with this same virtue of openness, risk-taking, and creativity. Also, Taiwan's soft power, and I know not everybody thinks soft power matters, but I told you I'm an optimist, is growing because China, the PRC, is wielding its hard power in more assertive ways, and that creates some space for Taiwan. The political institutions that Taiwan has built in the post-Cold War era, which reflect the will of the people, actually, I think, have at least the potential to address the central crisis of our time, a crisis which is facing not just Taiwan, but all developed countries, and that is how to distribute the fruits of development in a way that meets the needs of people and is sustainable for the earth. I know that a lot of people believe that authoritarianism is a virtue for policymaking, that you get better results if you have a state that is capable of making and enforcing demands against the economy and the people. I just can't believe it, because it seems to me that sustainable economics requires generosity and requires meeting the needs of people as they articulate them. That eventually, if you prioritize some kind of the building of the national juggernaut over the needs of actual flesh and blood human beings, eventually that strategy must be destined to fail. And Taiwan doesn't have those kinds of institutions anymore. The institutions Taiwan has today are the institutions that allow it to give people what they want and need within the framework of what is possible. Taiwan also, through the Cold War and post-Cold War, has developed a society that values fairness as well as growth, and a vivacious civil society that is tireless in pushing for fairness as well as growth. And Taiwan finally enjoys a strong sense of, if not perfectly shared identity, and I think that that is an unrealistic goal to set for any country, that people should share the same identity across everyone. But I think what Taiwan does have is a sense of common destiny, and that sense of common destiny is both a basis for resisting Beijing's pressure and could be, if it becomes necessary, the basis for finding a way forward with China in the future. So, Taiwan has always seemed to me simultaneously sort of really super intense and also open to anything, which is an odd combination, but it may be a very adaptive combination. The post-Cold War looks bleak, and not just for Taiwan. It's easy to conclude that Taiwan is not sustainable in the 21st century. But who among us would go back to the Cold War when Taiwan was poor, underdeveloped, authoritarian, and on the front line of a massive global confrontation? And who would go back to the end of the Cold War when the US looked like it was ready to walk away from Taiwan? So somehow Taiwan managed to survive the Cold War and the post-Cold War, and even to gain strength in these difficult moments. Its path has never been easy, but it's been sustaining for the last 70 years. So who am I to say it can't continue to do so? Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Very interesting, very insightful presentation. For a minute there, I wanted to break in and say the Wilson Center is a nonpartisan research institute.
Oh, sorry. I'm an academic. I still have free speech.
Well, we all know that. We have some time for Q&A. Bob, I don't know if you wanted to ask the first question, or we should just open it up.
Yeah, I will. Let me say, first of all, Shelley, I think Nancy would have been really proud to have your remarks as part of an event honoring her. She would have loved the fact that you believe that history matters and has something to tell us today. She would have loved your optimism. I'm not sure if she always would have shared it, but she would have valued it all the same. Abe, you mentioned Shelley's book, Why Taiwan Matters, which reminded me a year ago, in fact, a year ago, virtually this week, I think, the Wilson Center published, the Asia program published a volume with one of your essays entitled Why Taiwan Still Matters. So that was and is a timely update. If I may ask you about Taiwan's understanding today of what's going on here in Washington. In some respects, Donald Trump could have been and may be a friend, a protector. He was, after all, the first American president-elect to ever reach out to a Taiwanese president in a telephone call. In other respects, he probably causes, for a variety of reasons, causes considerable uneasiness in Taipei. So if you could give us, because I know that you continually exchange views with Taiwanese, if you can give us a sense of how they understand this man who, I think it's fair to say, is unique as an American president. And then, and probably more importantly, what is the Taiwanese strategy for dealing with these new circumstances?
Yeah, I have a tendency to forget the degree to which a lot of ordinary Taiwanese are, first of all, very focused on things that have direct relevance to their own experience. So they really don't necessarily know a whole lot about what's going on in, say, North America or South America or Europe. You know, that it can be a pretty insular little island. And I was reminded about that recently in a conversation where someone was saying, Taiwanese people love Donald Trump because he talks about Taiwan. And he seems really friendly to Taiwan. And, when they all know about the phone call and, so at a sort of popular level, I think there is a certain enthusiasm for those statements and actions from the administration or the pre-administration that reflect favorably on Taiwan. The flip side of that is that the things that happen that are not so positive generally get less attention in Taiwan. So, people were extremely happy with the Taiwan Travel Act passing and saw that as a strong affirmation of U.S. support for Taiwan. They're less well informed about other aspects of U.S. policy that might give pause to that position. So that's kind of the general public. I think the general public waits for Trump to say something good about Taiwan and then they applaud. But the government, the leadership, is very cautious because this administration could go either way. And which way it goes will not necessarily be not only determined, but even influenced by what Taiwan actually does. So in the past, Taiwanese leaders have thought, as long as we behave ourselves, everything's fine. And, you Chen Shui-bian kind of pushed the line and got pushed back. And with Trump, you just don't know. He's running a foreign policy that is simultaneously isolationist and interventionist, which is contradictory, and yet it's happening. And so my sense of the leadership in Taiwan is that they will do everything they can not to offend or transgress or embarrass Trump, but they will try to keep at a safe distance and stay below the radar as much as possible so that they don't attract his attention.
I think we can open things up for a little bit of Q&A. Please identify yourself and the institution that you represent. Yes, sir. We have microphones.
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an analyst and a former diplomat. I just heard Nancy say bravo. We've essentially been living with an amazing fig leaf with the Taiwan Relations Act. And I'm surprised it's gone on as long as it has. But given the totally flaccid response of the West to the conquest of the South China Sea, I'm thinking President for life, Xi Jinping will push the fig leaf. And I'm wondering if you could sort of speculate on those vulnerabilities and if there's any hope at all of our responding to those vulnerabilities.
So it may be a fig leaf, but it's ours, and we can wear it if we want to, right? I think that has to be the response. If the PRC pushes on the TRA, sorry, this is our it's not just a policy, it's the law, and so it's not going to change. And I think what the U.S. needs to do is to know what the TRA says, right? To know what our obligations and options under the TRA are, and to exercise those fully without worrying too much about whether that's going to offend someone in Beijing. So there are things that you choose your actions carefully to kind of calibrate the value of what you're doing against the cost of what you're doing in terms of U.S.-China relations. So you don't do things gratuitously, but you don't just let China dictate the terms of U.S.-Taiwan relations. And that's why I think, and I have to pause here and say that is something, that kind of logic is something that I learned from Bonnie Glaser as much as, and maybe more than Nancy Tucker, is like, be tough. Sorry, Bonnie. I didn't mean that Bonnie said the U.S. should be tough on China. That was me. But Bonnie makes me feel like it's important for the U.S. to know what its policy is and to act in accordance with its own policies and its own positions. So I don't think the TRA, again, as is so often the case, if something happens to the TRA, it'll be because somebody in this country made a bad decision, not because the Chinese government, the PRC government, could force the U.S. to make a change.
I think we should acknowledge the TRA and U.S. policy related to Taiwan is extremely complicated. That even people who focus on Asia policy still have trouble explaining what U.S. Taiwan policy is, let alone people who don't follow these things. So I think your point is very well taken on that. Yes, sir, in the front.
My name is Stephen Shore. How good is Taiwanese intelligence as to what is going on in the PRC?
Oh, gosh, I don't know. I think one of the things, though, that often I have a lot of conversations that take the form of, why are they not more worried? And one answer to why are they not more worried is, well, because they believe that the U.S. will save them. Another answer to why are they not more worried is that they believe that the PRC is so tangled up in other more pressing problems and challenges that it is unlikely to make Taiwan a high priority. And that second answer is not very satisfying to a lot of U.S. policymakers, but I am humble to that because I know that people in Taiwan have been living under this sword for 70 years. They have managed it somehow. So it's possible that they've just been kind of lucky. it's possible that they're too sanguine today, but it's also possible that they know something that I don't. And it could be that they know something that I don't because they have intelligence that makes them more comfortable. I mean, I don't know that that's true, but they certainly pay close attention to what goes on in mainland China, that's for sure.
There's the question. There we go. Let's take two questions out, two on the side here.
David Brown. Shelley, thank you for a very thoughtful and optimistic presentation. In your remarks, you said Taiwan's ties with the U.S. are more uncertain than ever before. And I would agree with that. I think it is not our bureaucracy, our Defense Department, our Congress, our academics, our civil society that are bringing that about. It's our president. Now, with our president in office and us being concerned to strengthen our ties, what should Americans be doing to build stronger relations with Taiwan so that Taiwan ties with the U.S. will survive this particular moment?
Let's collect a second question, too.
Hi, Professor Shelley. And just 12 years ago, when you were in Fudan, I was your sitting student. You remember? My name is Zhang Quanyi.
Okay. 欢迎.
Yes, yeah. And I'm happy here to your presentation. So my question concerns about the authoritarian shape, if I could say. And you in your presentation, also in your book, you mentioned several times of the foundation between Taiwan and the USA was the democracy. And I found that it caught my attention that in 1960s to 1970s, Taiwan was authoritarian regime. And if I'm not quite right, I could call now China also as kind of authoritarian system. And it reminded that one-party system and individual role, also the consensus, right, the censorship. But you also found that China seems more open, more progressive, and that stressed the interdependence, also the globalism of the shared community, and one more important thing that
We're going to need to get to the question mark pretty
okay,
soon.
the stress in the good relations with the leader, president. So will U.S. always say that Trump will take the privilege, this democracy privilege over Taiwan? So this is my question. Thank you.
So I really do think, I agree with David Brown that the unpredictability in U.S.-Taiwan relations is balanced on the head of a pin, right? It doesn't rest in any long-term trend or structural forces. If anything, I think the growing tensions between the U.S. and China, which are reflected in things like the South China Sea, should be enhancing U.S.-Taiwan relations and should be kind of, shoring up the value that Taiwan holds for the U.S. Sometimes that can be not so good for Taiwan when Taiwan is viewed as having utility for the U.S. because it's an irritant to the PRC. It frustrates the PRC's rise. That's actually not good for Taiwan. But thinking about Taiwan as a force that helps to stabilize the region or that provides economic and other kinds of benefits to the region, there are ways to think about Taiwan that don't rest on a kind of Taiwan as a tool in the toolbox of hostility between the U.S. and the PRC. But so there's nothing about the current moment that would dictate that U.S.-Taiwan relations would be highly uncertain and very insecure. It is this particular individual who has, even before his inauguration, he kind of put one foot in one side and the other foot in the other side. He took the phone call, which was aimed at building a foundation for enhanced U.S.-Taiwan relations under his administration. But when he got just a little bit of criticism for that, he put his foot in the other box and said, Tsai Ing-wen did this to me, and why should I? And suddenly he implicated Taiwan in all of the negative issues in U.S.-China relations. So, it's really, the problem is that he staked out positions on both sides of the Taiwan issue a month before he was even inaugurated. So the question is, how do we keep the relationship solid while we wait for this to be over? And I think one thing that we do is we continue to execute policy, routine aspects of policy. So, Congress does their thing, and I'm not a huge fan. Sorry, Mike, but I'm not a huge fan of the Taiwan Travel Act. I wouldn't have been a huge fan of the Taiwan Travel Act 2 years ago. But now I sort of feel like the Taiwan Travel Act sends the right kind of message at a moment when some kind of message is needed. We should go ahead and do complete the military sales that we've committed to. We should probably send someone important to open AIT's new building, just to make the point that at the working level and the day-to-day level, we still know what our policy is, where our interests lie, what our goals are, and this, we have to some extent respond to the stimuli that come from up the street, but we are not becoming that. So government officials are not becoming that. Business partners are not becoming that. Students who want to learn Chinese in Taiwan are not becoming that, and so on. To your question, Dr. Zhang, great to see you. I don't think, it's ironic that we have a president who says he doesn't care about political system, right? You can be authoritarian or democratic, it doesn't really matter, but he finds other reasons to reject China. So it's not that China is not democratic, but it is that China is powerful, growing, successful, and that Chinese practices in many ways do, in fact, work to the disadvantage of foreign economic partners. I think we have to acknowledge that as well. So I think that the value of democracy for Taiwan and the detriment of authoritarianism for the PRC are both sort of devalued at this moment, but probably will emerge in the future.
We are low on time, but I'd like to take Bonnie and then the three more, and then we'll be done.
Bonnie Glazer, CSIS. Thank you so much, Shelley, for your marvelous comments and insights. So my question is really about how you think generational change in Taiwan over the next, let's say, maybe 5 to 10 years will affect Taiwan's politics. There's, I think, a good chance that the voting age in Taiwan will be lowered to 18. Those people will, of course, then be voting. You have their attitudes toward mainland China may be different than older generation. What happens with the KMT, do you think, over the next 5 to 10 years? So if you could speak to some of those issues.
Yeah, we'll just do two more.
Shelley, thanks very much for excellent presentation. I'm Garrett Van der Wees. I'm now teaching history of Taiwan at George Mason University. So I'd like to get into the history for a second, if, if I may. On your second question, you said, where did Taiwan come from and how did it come into being? I think it's good to emphasize that there was a Taiwan before World War II, before the Cold War, before the post-Cold War. Too often, I think, Taiwan is only viewed against the background of the civil war between the Kuomintang and the CCP. But before that, there were people in Taiwan who considered themselves Taiwanese. And I think that Taiwanese identity was already shaped in the early part of the Japanese administration, when the Hakka, the Holo, and the Aborigines bound together to resist the Japanese. So there is much more in the early period. And I think for the policy-making community, it's probably important to emphasize that. And on your final point, you were a bit pessimistic against your own intuition, but I'd like to be very pessimistic and positive and think that Taiwan has a pretty bright future ahead of it.
If we could pass to Ambassador Roy.
Shelley, thanks for a terrific presentation. I got a little edgy, though, in some of your comments in terms of how we should behave right now. And if there was a gap in your presentation, I would argue that it was a failure to address the issue of the One China policy. Because it was the One China policy that provided the space for Taiwan to have the development that you outlined, I thought, very eloquently. And the only time when the One China policy came under threat was during the Clinton administration, when you had the transition to democracy in Taiwan coinciding with the reversal of the U.S. position on the visit by Lee Teng-hui, and we ended up with a military crisis in the Taiwan Strait. To bring history into it, why would we want to repeat that history? The Taiwan Relations Act is the biggest, the Taiwan Travel Act is the biggest threat to the One China policy because it basically undermines the distinction between the official and the unofficial relations, which are inherent in the One China policy. And you talk about maybe wanting to have some important figure visit Taiwan. It seems to me that if you're concerned about the future of Taiwan, then not beginning to erode the One China policy and forcing the PRC into a reaction which would create a crisis would be vitally important. Could you address that contradiction?
Yes, yes, you know, that's exactly right. That's why 2 years ago I would have absolutely 100% agreed with you that something like the Taiwan Travel Act would have felt like a gratuitous provocation, you know, something that members of Congress do because they don't understand the consequences of their actions. And it may still be so. It just may be less so because the value of the signal is different when the other signals are degrading, you know, are less capable of conveying clearly. So, but I know what you mean. And so this is back to David's question, you know, this is why we have to be really smart about how we do things right now. It is more important than ever that at the working level, like the people who actually who prepare good recommendations and briefings do that in a way that does not challenge the One China policy, that carries out the Taiwan Travel Act in a way that can be defended in the context of the One China policy. And I appreciate that is really difficult, which is another reason why I am a free-speaking academic instead of, you know, actually trying to make these things work. I also think, you know, my liability as a single-minded Taiwan specialist, I absolutely should think more about the One China policy as the bookend to the Taiwan Relations Act. And it is true that without the One China policy, the Taiwan Relations Act would be maybe unnecessary, but certainly ineffective. Yes, there also was a Taiwan before the Cold War, and I'm glad to know that students at George Mason are getting to learn Taiwan history. I guess Japanese colonialism deserves its own lecture, and I was really trying to think about Taiwan as a self-governing, democratic, all that stuff. And sadly, it was not self-governing under the Japanese. And then to Bonnie's question, generational trends, this is, like one of my all-time favorite topics, but I feel increasingly uncertain because it seems to me that the generational trends are internally, I'm not going to say contradictory because it's not a contradiction. It's just something that I can't understand. I can't reconcile fully. That simultaneously, you have young people in Taiwan who are much more comfortable with being in China, with being engaged in China, with traveling back and forth and all that stuff than their predecessors, one. Two, much less, well, there are dogmatic people in every generation, but I think the community of dogmatic, either unificationists or independence activists in the older generation is somewhat larger. So the younger generation are more toward the center on that issue and less, on average, feeling the need to be on one side or the other. But at the same time, they do have this deep understanding of themselves as Taiwanese. And they don't seem to have any sympathy for or understanding of the position that the PRC takes, which prioritizes history as the thing that should define how we all live now, right? To me, that's the fundamental difference between Taiwan and the PRC, is in the PRC, when people say, 我们有5000年的历史, when they say we have 5,000 years of history, what they mean is that everything that happens today is part of this 5,000 years of continuous trajectory, and that history needs to be embodied in the contemporary world. And people in Taiwan just don't think like that. They just don't think like that. They think we should make our own life. We should make our own world. We should do our own thing. It doesn't matter that our ancestors were whatever. And that to me is the thing that's hard for me to reconcile, is you have this generation of people who say, I don't know, Chinese, Taiwanese, whatever. But I know where I live, and I know who I am, and I know what I want. And what I am is a Taiwanese performance artist, and what I want is to do my show in Shanghai. And I don't see a contradiction there.
Well, this was, I'm sorry, I think we're quite over time. I wanted to thank everybody. Thank you all for coming, especially thanks Shelley for coming. As I looked across the audience, as I was listening to your remarks, I was looking through the audience, seeing a lot of very accomplished scholars, but also a lot of people who've had a hand in formulating and implementing U.S. policy in Asia, especially in China and Taiwan. And I expect they would agree with me in that. I found that your comments and your both in your remarks and your Q&A, both intellectually rich, but also very helpful in thinking about how we continue to sustain Taiwan through the 21st century in light of challenges that we face at home, but also the challenge posed by a rising China. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming.